The first scream came long before anyone understood the danger. It wasn't the violent turbulence that frightened people. Airliners shook all the time. Most passengers gripped their armrests, laughed nervously, or pulled their blankets tighter before returning to their movies. This time was different. The aircraft suddenly dipped several hundred feet, sending drinks crashing into the ceiling. Oxygen masks trembled inside their compartments. Overhead bins rattled violently as terrified cries echoed through the cabin. Then, silence. No reassuring voice came over the speakers. No announcement from the captain. No explanation. Inside the forward galley, senior flight attendant Emily Harper stared at the sealed cockpit door. Nearly 10 minutes had passed since the last communication. She had knocked again and again. Nothing. Using the emergency override, she finally forced the cockpit open. What she found stole the air from her lungs. The captain had collapsed over the controls, barely breathing. The first officer was unconscious, blood running down the side of his face after striking the instrument panel during the violent turbulence. A chorus of warning alarms filled the cockpit. Amber lights, red lights, constant electronic beeping. The autopilot had entered a critical fault mode. No one was truly flying the aircraft anymore. 273 lives were balanced on systems that could fail at any second. Emily's hands trembled as she stumbled back into the cabin, desperately scanning every face. Is there anyone at all, who knows how to fly this airplane? Silence spread faster than panic. Passengers exchanged frightened looks. A businessman slowly lowered his laptop. A little boy stopped crying and looked toward the front. Even the whispers disappeared. Then, from seat 11C, a woman quietly folded the page of the novel she had been reading. She looked no different from hundreds of other travelers. A simple navy coat, no jewelry, no makeup beyond what the morning required. She calmly placed a faded leather bookmark between the pages before standing. There was no rush, no dramatic speech, no attempt to convince anyone. She simply met Emily's terrified eyes and asked one question. "How long has the cockpit been unattended?" "About 9 minutes," Emily whispered. The woman gave one slow nod. "That's longer than I'd like." Without another word, she walked toward the cockpit. Something about the way she moved silenced the entire cabin. It wasn't confidence. It wasn't courage. It was recognition. The quiet certainty of someone returning to a life she had promised herself she would never touch again. No one on that airplane knew her name. But before the night was over, fighter pilots flying at twice the speed of sound would recognize a voice the world believed had vanished forever. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from. 6 hours earlier, Flight Horizon 482 had left London under clear evening skies. It was supposed to be another uneventful journey across the Atlantic, a routine overnight flight carrying business executives, vacationing families, students returning home, and elderly couples eager to see their grandchildren. For most people on board, it was just another trip. For the woman in Seat 11C, it was another chance to remain invisible. Her boarding pass identified her as Evelyn Brooks, a name that meant nothing to anyone around her. She had checked in without luggage, declined the airport lounge, paid cash for a cup of coffee, and quietly disappeared into the waiting crowd before boarding began. She preferred it that way. The fewer conversations she had, the fewer questions people asked. Once seated by the window, Evelyn opened an old mystery novel whose pages had softened with age. She wasn't truly reading. Every few minutes, her eyes drifted toward the wing outside. She watched the flaps move during takeoff, listened to the subtle changes in engine pitch, and instinctively counted the seconds between each adjustment and thrust. Old habits refused to die. Across the aisle, an energetic 8-year-old named Noah pressed his face against the window, asking his father endless questions about flying above the clouds. A retired schoolteacher knitted a tiny blue sweater for her newborn granddaughter. 2 college roommates debated where they would eat after landing, while several exhausted business travelers had already fallen asleep before the aircraft reached cruising altitude. Senior flight attendant Emily Harper moved gracefully through the cabin, greeting passengers with the kind of genuine warmth that couldn't be taught during airline training. After nearly 12 years in the air, she had learned to recognize anxious flyers, lonely travelers, and families needing extra attention. She noticed Evelyn almost immediately, not because the woman caused trouble, because she didn't. She declined dinner with a polite smile. She never adjusted her seat. She never reached for the entertainment screen. She simply sat in complete silence, occasionally glancing toward the cockpit whenever the door opened during routine service. Emily found it unusual, but not alarming. Meanwhile, 37,000 feet above the Atlantic, dark clouds slowly gathered ahead. The weather radar painted an ugly picture inside the cockpit. The captain frowned as the turbulence forecast grew worse by the minute. Behind him, none of the passengers realized that the peaceful flight they had boarded would soon become a desperate fight for survival, and that the quiet stranger in seat 11C had noticed the first warning signs long before anyone else. Long before anyone knew her as Evelyn Brooks, she had lived under a different name, a name spoken with quiet respect inside military hangars and command centers, but rarely outside them. She had once been Commander Elena Ward. To the public, she never existed. To the pilots who had flown beside her, she was known by a single call sign. Phantom? The nickname wasn't earned because she flew the fastest aircraft or broke the most records. It came from the way she disappeared. During advanced combat exercises, radar operators would watch their screens in disbelief as her aircraft slipped through defensive coverage that should have been impossible to penetrate. She never relied on luck. She studied every mission until she knew it better than the people who designed it. While others trusted speed, Elena trusted patience. She believed every machine, every storm, and every opponent had a weakness if you observed long enough. Her instructors often joked that she didn't fly airplanes. She convinced them to obey her. By the time she turned 35, Elena had become one of the military's most trusted test pilots, flying experimental aircraft that many others refused to touch. New engines, unstable flight systems, dangerous prototypes. She accepted every assignment with the same calm expression. Fear was never something she ignored. It was something she organized. Then came the mission that erased her from history. Officially, it was described as a routine training exercise that ended in tragedy. News reports announced that Commander Elena Ward had been lost after her aircraft disappeared during a classified operation over hostile territory. A memorial service followed. Flags were folded, speeches were delivered. Her name was carved into polished stone alongside pilots who would never return. But the truth was buried behind locked doors. Elena had survived. The operation itself had succeeded, but revealing that she was alive would have exposed people still working deep inside enemy networks. To protect them, military leaders made a painful decision. Every official record would state that she had died. Elena never argued. She signed the documents without hesitation. If disappearing meant others could make it home alive, then disappearing became her final assignment. Years passed. She moved from city to city, lived quietly, avoided friendships, and never looked back at the life she'd left behind. She convinced herself that the cockpit belonged to her past. But as the aircraft shuddered high above the Atlantic and warning lights flashed beyond the locked cockpit door, one truth quietly resurfaced inside her. You can bury a name, you can hide a career, but you can never truly silence the person you were born to become. The moment Evelyn stepped through the cockpit door, the outside world disappeared. The frightened voices from the cabin faded behind her, replaced by a relentless chorus of warning alarms. Every few seconds, another light blinked across the instrument panel, painting the cockpit in flashes of red, amber, and white. The aircraft was still moving steadily through the night sky, but it was no longer truly under control. Captain Michael Donovan lay slumped over the left controls, his breathing shallow and uneven. His face had turned an unnatural shade of gray. Beside him, First Officer Ryan Cole remained unconscious, a deep cut above his eyebrow slowly staining his uniform. Neither man could help. For one brief moment, Evelyn simply stood there. Emily, watching from the doorway, felt her stomach tighten. The woman wasn't moving. She wasn't touching anything. She was only looking. Her eyes swept across the cockpit with astonishing speed, absorbing every flashing indicator, every engine reading, every navigation display. It wasn't panic. It was calculation. Then everything changed. Evelyn gently eased the captain's hands away from the controls before checking both pilots with practiced efficiency. She tilted the captain's head to keep his airway clear, secured the first officer's seat harness to prevent further injury, and finally lowered herself into the right seat. The cockpit suddenly became quiet. Not because the alarms had stopped, but because every movement she made carried absolute purpose. Her fingers danced across the overhead panel. One warning disappeared, then another. She reset a malfunctioning flight management system before disconnecting the unstable autopilot, just seconds before it attempted an unsafe correction. The massive aircraft gave a violent shudder. Several passengers screamed. Then, almost magically, the shaking eased, the nose leveled, the wings steadied. Emily couldn't explain what she had just witnessed. It felt less like someone taking control of an airplane and more like someone calming a frightened animal. Without glancing at a checklist, Evelyn tuned the emergency radio frequency from memory. "This is Meridian Flight 482, declaring Mayday. Both flight crew are medically incapacitated. I'm assuming flight control. We have 273 souls on board. Request immediate vectors to the nearest suitable runway." The air traffic controller answered almost instantly. "Meridian 482. Identify yourself. State your qualifications." Evelyn's eyes never left the horizon. "My qualifications can wait." Her voice remained calm. "The lives behind me cannot." Miles away, emergency controllers exchanged uneasy glances. Standard procedure no longer seemed adequate. As radar screens tracked the crippled airliner drifting toward American airspace, another decision was quietly made inside a military command center. 2 interceptor fighters were ordered into the sky. The announcement Emily had dreaded finally echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice began, steady despite the fear twisting inside her, "we're experiencing a serious medical emergency involving our flight crew. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have someone qualified at the controls, and we're preparing for an emergency landing. The words were carefully chosen. But passengers heard what wasn't said. A wave of whispers rolled through the cabin. What happened to the pilots? Who's flying the plane? Are we going to crash? A baby began crying near the rear galley. Across the aisle, Noah reached for his father's hand, his usual curiosity replaced by confusion. His father forced a reassuring smile, but the tightening grip on the armrest betrayed his own fear. Near the emergency exit, an elderly couple quietly clasped hands. Neither spoke. After 50 years together, they didn't need words to understand what the other was thinking. Meanwhile, Evelyn faced a different battle. The aircraft suddenly lurched to the left. A sharp warning flashed across the navigation display. Hydraulic pressure low. Another alert followed immediately. Auto thrust failure. One problem was manageable. Two at once demanded absolute precision. Without hesitation, Evelyn disengaged another automated system before it could worsen the imbalance. Her hands moved confidently across switches and throttles, making tiny corrections that barely seemed noticeable. Yet each movement kept the enormous aircraft stable. Air traffic control returned to the radio. Meridian 482. Federal regulations require us to verify the identity of the individual operating the aircraft. Evelyn adjusted the thrust manually while watching the horizon. I understand. There was no frustration in her voice. But every second I spend proving who I am is one less second spent keeping this airplane in the sky. Silence followed. Controllers exchanged uncertain looks inside the operations center. Finally, a senior supervisor leaned toward his microphone. Meridian 482. Identity verification is deferred. You have priority handling. Continue present heading. Thank you. Only 2 words. Yet everyone listening realized something unusual was happening. Then another voice broke onto the emergency frequency. It wasn't civilian. It carried the clipped confidence of military command. Meridian 482. This is Air Defense Command. Due to the unknown status of the pilot in command, 2 interceptor aircraft have been scrambled to escort your flight. Estimated contact, 12 minutes. Emily looked through the cockpit window into the endless darkness. Nothing. Just clouds. Then Evelyn quietly whispered, almost to herself, So, they've come. For the first time since entering the cockpit, something flickered across her face. Not fear, recognition. And somewhere beyond the night sky, 2 fighter jets were racing toward the airliner. About to recognize a voice history had declared silent forever. The first sign wasn't visible. It was audible. A low, distant rumble vibrated through the cockpit, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind. But Evelyn recognized it instantly. She had spent thousands of hours listening to aircraft engines. Every engine had its own voice. These belonged to fighters. Seconds later, 2 sharp gray silhouettes burst through the clouds, sliding effortlessly into formation on either side of the struggling airliner. Their navigation lights blinked against the darkness as they matched the commercial jet's speed with breathtaking precision. Emily gasped. Several passengers near the windows pulled out their phones, recording the incredible sight without understanding what it meant. Children pointed excitedly. Adults stared in stunned silence. Inside the cockpit, Evelyn didn't even glance twice. She already knew why they were there. The radio crackled. Meridian 482, this is Falcon 1. We have visual contact. Please confirm the identity of the individual flying the aircraft. Evelyn remained focused on the instruments. Outside, the fighter pilot waited. Air traffic control waited. Military command waited. For nearly 5 years, she had hidden behind borrowed names, temporary apartments, and quiet routines. She had promised herself the woman she used to be would never return, because if that name was spoken again, everything would change. Her fingers tightened around the control column. Ahead, storm clouds continued to build over the eastern coastline. Behind her sat 273 people who had no idea their lives depended on a secret buried years ago. She had a choice: protect her anonymity or protect the people behind her. The decision lasted less than a heartbeat. She pressed the transmit button. This is the acting pilot of Meridian 482. A pause. Then she spoke the words she never believed she would say again. My former military designation, she inhaled slowly, was Phantom. Silence swallowed every radio frequency. Controllers stopped speaking. Technicians looked up from their screens. Even the fighter pilot seemed frozen. Finally, Falcon 1 answered. His professional tone was gone. It had been replaced by something far more personal. Phantom, he almost whispered the call sign. I don't believe this. Another voice joined the frequency. Falcon 2. Control, confirm what we just heard. The operations room searched old classified records. Within seconds, a secure file flashed onto a senior officer's monitor. Status: killed in action. Date of death: 5 years prior. The room fell silent. Falcon 1 keyed his microphone again. His voice carried unmistakable respect. Ma'am, every pilot in my squadron grew up hearing stories about Phantom. We were told you gave everything on your last mission. Evelyn allowed herself the faintest smile. Stories have a way of ending too early. She returned her attention to the cockpit. The mission isn't over yet. And as the fighter jets tightened their protective formation around the airliner, every person listening realized they weren't simply escorting a civilian aircraft anymore. They were flying beside a legend who had just returned from the dead. The moment Evelyn revealed her call sign, the mission changed. She was no longer just an anonymous passenger trying to save an airplane. Now she was Phantom, and every controller, military officer, and fighter pilot on the frequency knew exactly what that meant. But legends didn't make airplanes easier to land. The aircraft suddenly lurched as another pocket of violent turbulence slammed into its left wing. The cockpit shook so hard that loose checklists scattered across the floor. A piercing alarm erupted. Master warning. Then another. Left hydraulic system degrading. Emily grabbed the cockpit doorway to keep herself from falling. Outside, rain battered the windshield with such force that the runway ahead disappeared behind a wall of gray. Lightning flashed across the clouds, briefly illuminating the two escort fighters as they fought to maintain formation. Falcon 1 broke the silence. Phantom, weather over the airfield is deteriorating. Crosswinds are increasing. I can see them, Evelyn replied calmly. Her voice never rose. Her breathing never changed. She adjusted the throttles by barely a fraction, compensating for the unstable airflow. Every correction was almost invisible, yet the giant aircraft obeyed instantly, as though it trusted her more than its own computers. In the cabin, panic was becoming impossible to contain. One passenger stood up, demanding answers before Marcus. Another flight attendant gently guided him back into his seat. Please, sit down, sir. You're making it harder for everyone. The man looked around at the frightened faces surrounding him. Children clutched their parents. An elderly woman silently prayed with trembling hands. Noah leaned close to the window, staring at the fighter jet flying only a few hundred feet away. Dad, he whispered, are they protecting us? His father swallowed hard before answering. They wouldn't be here if someone wasn't protecting all of us. Back in the cockpit, another warning flashed. A strong gust shoved the aircraft several degrees off course. The altitude dropped. 100 feet, 200, 300. Emily's heart nearly stopped. Falcon 2 called urgently over the radio. You're drifting left. I know. Evelyn's hands moved faster than anyone could follow. She countered the wind, balanced the engines manually, and eased the aircraft back onto the proper approach path with astonishing precision. The descent stabilized. Inside the control tower, seasoned air traffic controllers watched in disbelief. One veteran controller quietly removed his headset for a moment and muttered, I've worked emergencies for 28 years. He stared at the radar screen. I've never seen anyone recover an aircraft like that. Ahead, the runway lights finally pierced the storm. Only a few miles remained. But Evelyn knew the hardest part of the mission was still waiting. The next 3 minutes would decide whether 273 people walked away from this flight or became another tragic headline remembered only by history. The runway lights finally emerged through the storm like a trail of stars cutting through the darkness. There it is, Emily whispered, barely believing her own eyes. From the cabin windows, passengers could see rows of flashing emergency vehicles lining both sides of the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue teams stood ready, their blue and red lights reflecting off the rain-soaked pavement. No one spoke. The silence inside the aircraft was almost unbearable. Every person on board understood that this was the moment that mattered. Evelyn lowered the landing gear. A loud mechanical rumble echoed beneath the cabin. She watched the indicators carefully. One green light, then another. For a split second, the third remained dark. Emily's heart stopped. Gear isn't locked, she whispered. Evelyn didn't panic. She reached for the emergency extension handle and released it with one smooth pull. Another heavy thud shook the aircraft. The final green light illuminated. 3 green. Landing gear secure. Falcon 1's voice broke over the radio. Phantom, you're perfectly aligned. Winds shifting from your right. 5 knots stronger than forecast. Copy. She corrected the nose by only a few degrees. The aircraft responded instantly. Rain hammered against the windshield so hard that visibility dropped to almost nothing. Then, a violent crosswind slammed into the right wing. The left wing dipped dangerously. Passengers screamed. Luggage shifted overhead. The aircraft drifted toward the edge of the runway approach. Inside the control tower, every controller instinctively held their breath. Evelyn reacted before anyone else even processed what had happened. Her left hand eased the control column into the wind, while her right hand adjusted engine thrust independently, bouncing the aircraft against the powerful gust. The enormous jet slowly straightened, perfectly centered once again. She's got it, one rescue firefighter whispered from the runway below. She's actually got it. The runway threshold flashed beneath the nose. 20 feet. 10. 5. Evelyn gently raised the nose. For one suspended heartbeat, the aircraft seemed to float between sky and earth. Then, thud. The main landing gear kissed the runway with firm, controlled precision. Not hard, not soft. Exactly right. Cheers erupted inside the cockpit, but Evelyn wasn't finished. She deployed reverse thrust. The engines roared. Water sprayed behind the wheels as the aircraft raced down the soaked runway. 100 knots. 80. 60. 40. Finally, the massive jet rolled to a complete stop. For 2 silent seconds, nobody moved. Then the cabin exploded. People cried openly. Strangers embraced one another. Parents held their children tighter than ever before. Emily covered her face as tears streamed down her cheeks. Outside, the 2 fighter jets soared overhead in a graceful banking turn before lowering their wings toward the runway, a silent salute visible to everyone watching below. Evelyn closed her eyes for the first time since entering the cockpit. The mission was finally over. For several long seconds after the aircraft stopped, nobody moved. The engines slowly wound down, their deep roar fading into an almost surreal silence. Rain continued to drum against the fuselage, but inside the cabin, the only sounds were uneven breaths, quiet sobs, and the overwhelming realization that everyone was still alive. Then the applause began. One passenger started clapping. Another joined. Within moments, all 273 passengers were on their feet, applauding through tears. Some hugged complete strangers. Others simply buried their faces in their hands, overcome by relief. Emily leaned against the cockpit door, unable to stop crying. She had trained for emergencies her entire career, but nothing had prepared her for witnessing one person carry hundreds of lives through impossible odds. Inside the cockpit, Evelyn remained focused. While everyone else celebrated, she calmly completed the aircraft shutdown checklist from memory. Fuel pumps off, hydraulic system secured, electrical loads reduced. Every switch moved with the same quiet precision that had brought the aircraft safely to the ground. Only after the final display went dark did she allow herself a slow breath. Outside, emergency crews rushed toward the aircraft. Paramedics boarded first, reaching Captain Donovan within seconds. His pulse had stabilized, and although he remained unconscious, the medical team exchanged hopeful looks. He had survived. Moments later, First Officer Cole opened his eyes as medics treated the injury on his head. "Did we land?" he asked weakly. One paramedic smiled. "You had some unexpected help." As passengers began stepping onto the mobile stairs, they entered the cool night air in stunned silence. Many paused at the bottom to look back at the airplane that had nearly become their final destination. Camera flashes suddenly lit up the tarmac. News helicopters circled overhead. Someone had already leaked the story. Then another sound echoed across the airfield. 2 fighter jets taxied to a stop nearby. Their canopies lifted. The pilots climbed down and walked directly toward Evelyn. Every firefighter, medic, mechanic, and military officer instinctively stopped what they were doing. Without a single command being given, both fighter pilots came to attention. Then they saluted. Not because protocol demanded it, because respect did. Evelyn looked at the 2 young aviators for a long moment. Then, with flawless military precision she hadn't displayed in years, she returned the salute. One of the pilots lowered his hand and spoke quietly. "Ma'am, every generation has someone we're told we'll never meet." He smiled. "I never imagined ours would save my life before I had the chance to thank her." For the first time that night, Evelyn's guarded expression softened. But deep inside, she knew the hardest part of her journey hadn't ended on the runway. It was only just beginning. By sunrise, the story had traveled farther than Flight Meridian 482 ever could. Television networks interrupted their regular programming. Aviation experts replayed radar data frame by frame. Videos recorded by passengers spread across the internet at breathtaking speed, showing 2 fighter jets escorting a rain-soaked airliner through the darkness. But one question echoed everywhere. Who was the woman who landed the plane? Government officials refused to answer. Military spokespeople offered only carefully worded statements. The official reports praised the flight crew, emergency responders, and air traffic controllers, but the woman called Phantom remained a mystery, exactly as she had hoped. Weeks later, Captain Donovan finally left the hospital. His first request surprised everyone. He didn't ask to see the aircraft. He didn't ask to review the investigation. He asked to meet the woman who had finished the flight he never could. When they finally met in a quiet rehabilitation center, neither of them spoke for several moments. Donovan slowly extended his hand. "I've landed airplanes for 26 years, he said softly. "But that night, you carried my passengers home." Evelyn smiled gently. "We carried them home." He shook his head. "No." His eyes filled with emotion. "You carried all of us." Meanwhile, the 2 young fighter pilots returned to active duty. Whenever new recruits joined their squadron, stories inevitably turned to aviation legends. This time, they no longer repeated rumors. They told the truth. They spoke about a woman who had disappeared from history without complaint, a pilot who had sacrificed her own identity so others could continue living theirs, and who, when faced with the choice between protecting herself or saving complete strangers, never hesitated. Months later, a young cadet visited the National Aviation Museum. He stopped before an exhibit honoring courageous pilots throughout history. One display case remained empty except for a small silver plaque. It read, "Some heroes cannot be fully named. Their greatest missions remain unwritten." The cadet stared at it for a long time before quietly asking his instructor, "Why is the case empty?" The older pilot smiled, "Because some people don't leave behind trophies." He looked toward the open sky beyond the museum windows. They leave behind lives. Far above the clouds, commercial aircraft continued crossing oceans every single day. Most passengers would never know how close one flight had come to becoming tragedy. They would never know that an ordinary woman sitting quietly by a window had once carried a forgotten legend inside her. They would never know that true courage rarely announces itself. It simply stands up when everyone else cannot. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. The strongest heroes are not the ones searching for applause. They are the ones willing to disappear until the moment the world needs them most. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more unforgettable stories, and share it with someone who believes quiet courage still exists. And before you go, tell us in the comments, which moment stayed with you the longest? We'd love to read your thoughts.